Originally, this was supposed to be a stream. I'm supposed to be, in fact, at the time I'm recording this, more or less streaming now, and it was going to be. But there's a thing, and I want to talk about this first before we get into today's topic. There's this there's this issue I have with streaming because I tend to stream in like the middle of the day because it's my work day, and the people who most watch my stuff watch during the day, but a whole lot of writers tend to watch my stuff like hours later in the evening when it's not always feasible or doable for me for a number of reasons to stream at night anymore. There's just a lot going on and a lot of other stuff. So it always feels weird when I stream in the midday and the audience is small. I take it maybe probably too personally. And it led me to really worry about today's topic because today it gets a little technical, and historically my technical videos don't always track particularly well. So I'm hoping that by recording this instead of just, streaming it to one or two people, I hope by recording this and really slowing down and walking through the parts, this becomes much clearer for you, clearer for me, and we all get something good out of it. Today, as the slide in front of you shows, we're going to talk about how to organize your story. This isn't just another sort of generic, bland method of like, um, do a plot, do some characters, do the world, start writing. I want to give you a toolbox with lots of small tools in it, little precise things that will allow you to shape and frame and understand story, not just as like the creative thing you made up, but also as pieces of a big jigsaw puzzle where you also have the ability to trim the jigsaw puzzle piece as you see fit. Organizing your story is a critical skill, absolutely critical. I think it's probably the first skill you need to get a handle on. And when I say that, I don't mean like um, you need to get it all right and then understand everything and then see the entirety of all the story and then start writing. That's not the impression I want to give. I don't really mean to suggest that at all. And I think it's a huge problem when people who give writing advice tend to tell you things like, you got to do all this work up front and then you get to write, because it perpetuates a lot of really bad habits. It perpetuates a lot of pressure on yourself and expectation. And it's just not true. It's just plain not true. The thing here to think about in organizing your story is just a matter of setting things up so that in the future, using those things, you can be as successful as you want to be, or even more than you thought you could be. That's really the whole point of organizing a story. You're doing it in such a way that it helps you later. It's not about showing it off. It's not about doing it right as though you've got to like get a grade on a system. And it's really not about doing it so that you become like publishing desirable. The whole goal of organizing your story and whatever you want to do it and however you want to do it, the whole goal is to um, really sit down and have a system with your story that allows you to build and grow whatever it is you want to do. If you want to stop and make a series, if you want to do a one off, if you want to tell whatever you want, the best way to do that isn't to just sit down and start, spooling out all your thoughts in 55,000 bajillion notes on your phone or in excited Discord messages to your friends or whatever. The whole thing you got to do is really build yourself a method that works for you. So I'm hoping that if I've done this right, I've got a method that maybe will work for you. Maybe, hopefully. I think it will. I've used this method with over 200 clients. Now, I know historically I have a terrible track record at telling you about my business because it always feels a little weird and a little awkward and kind of gross. But let me tell you that the system I've got for you today, if you want to go more in depth with it, if you want to get way better at it, if you want to see just how far it goes and what it can do, I would strongly recommend that you go down in the description to this video below and click the link for the website and make an appointment, because this system is what I've taught to authors who are bestsellers, who have gotten started, who have finished, who have written, who still write, who win awards, who've done a million bajillion things. I think this is going to help you. I want to help you organize your story. So how do we get started? We're going to start with a real simple premise that you just want to write a book. Now, I know some people out there, most of you probably, are already writing. You've already started. That's fine. It's really okay. But I want to come at this from the premise of you've got the most collection of ideas, maximum just heap of stuff, and a little bit of writing or some chunk of writing, but it doesn't feel focused or it doesn't feel organized. So you want to write a book, but you don't really know how to do it or where to begin, and you feel lost and you feel stuck. That's sort of the person to whom I'm speaking most. But if you're somebody who's, checking this out because you want to get started, because you haven't done anything and you're afraid and you're overwhelmed by writing advice and who knows what, well, this is going to help you too. Because organization is king of all the mountains and seats and whatever other king metaphors you want. It is how well you organize that allows you to do all the things that you want to do. Better organization makes all these things possible. Not better creativity, not better accumulation of books on a shelf that you never read, just straight up organization. So here's what I've got. Because no matter what you're writing, you're going to need a system for organizing that is not limited by genre. It's not like we have one system that we use only for science fiction and one system, a totally different system we only use for fantasy, or a system that only works when we're writing romance novels or whatever. You need a system that is a system that is a system no matter what. You need something flexible, because not every story you tell, even if it's the same series or has some of the same characters, not every story is the same way. So you need it to be flexible. But the minute you start talking about a system that is not tied down to a genre and can be flexible, most people start imagining this like big, giant, complicated octopus of like a billion parts and a billion tentacles, and it's all over the place. And you most definitely need something manageable. Because if it's not manageable, if you've got to consider and think about 10 million things and keep this in your head and keep that going, and ooh, don't forget about this and definitely don't forget about that, you're not likely to use it. You're just not. And you'll feel overwhelmed and you'll feel frustrated and you'll blame yourself because the thing sounds like it should be working. You have an expectation that everybody else makes it work, and then you feel bad because you can't get it to work. Well, I'm going to tell you that that's not always your fault. You're not always the reason why things aren't working. Sometimes the system isn't a good fit for you. And sometimes the system is over-engineered and messy and just not great, and it needs more care than it received before it comes to you. You need something that works. That's what I'm offering today. But we can't start organizing our story until we start organizing our mind. How we think about this, all of this matters. Because if you're the sort of person who's like, no, just get me right to the writing, get me right to the publishing, you're missing a significant portion of this. Because if you've ever stopped and worried and been scared and frustrated that you're not good enough, or that your writing isn't good enough, or that publishing seems scary, or that you're really freaked out about the possibility of being rejected, or things are just, up in the air because you're trying this and who knows if it's going to work, and you're worried that I guess somehow you're going to be wasting your time because nobody's going to like it. If you've had any fears like that, I would like to spend a few moments here talking to you first, because I love you. You're a good person. You're doing the best you can, but you're wrong, because you're not wasting your time, because you're making a thing and you're enjoying the making of it. Yes, I understand you've tied a lot of balloons to this. You've hitched a lot of wagons to it, that you want to do a thing and do a good job, and that you want it to sell well, and you want to be financially successful or regarded by the larger world of whatever they are as an author. But that's not the only criteria that matters. The first criteria that matters is, are you enjoying doing this? Did the effort of you making this thing make you happy? Did you like writing? Do you enjoy writing? Because in the process of transforming from, hey, here's a thing I just do whatever when it's no big deal, to I'm going to try and become an author with a book to sell or publish, it can turn the thing you love doing into a job. And for a lot of writers, even though they're very talented, very creative, they're just not really ready to sit with that feeling of, oh, this thing I love is now a thing I love and it has to be the thing I do. Because it takes some of the fun away from it. When there are stakes, when it matters, when it's a big deal, then yeah, it changes people's relationship to it. And you need to know that that's going to happen. It needs to happen, because otherwise you'll never push yourself across the finish line. And that's fine if you don't. That's fine if you write a story and it's in its best shape and you just never publish it. That's okay. You didn't waste your time. You made a book. It made you happy. You made a very good book. But crossing that finish line, transforming things into something more commercial and professional, if we can call it that, that's a decision that has to come not from a position of, gosh, I hope other people validate me, but a position of, I am choosing myself first, not selfishly, not arrogantly. You don't think you're better than anybody else. You just want to do this thing, and there's room for you to do it. The world lets you do it. You have the ability to do it. Why not do it? You need to know that you can do this. You need to know that with absolute, unshakable surety, with no way of rattling that. You can have doubt that you're doing it well. You can be frustrated that it's not going faster or easier, but you can't let anyone else or yourself talk you out of the fact that, yes, you can in fact do this thing. There's plenty of resources to help you. There's plenty of people you can ask for help. You can always come ask me. You can always listen to a podcast episode, or, get an appointment, take 30 minutes and I'll give you a rah-rah speech or anything like that. You can do this. It is within your power. And don't turn that sentence to anything else. Don't say, well, I could do this, but, or I would like to do this only if. No, you can do this. Your concept of your ability matters. You can do this. And likewise, to follow up on that, you're the only one who can do it the way you would do it. Lots of other people could have the same idea. Sure, you might not be the only person writing a romance novel with those two kinds of characters. You might not be the only person who thought to have, a robot in their fantasy novel. You are not that only person. However, you are the only person who could write that thing in your particular way. Your voice, your experience, your word choice, your tone, your theme, your inflection, your construction. They're all you. Those are your creative fingerprints. Other people have creative fingerprints, but you're the only one with yours. And you need to know, no matter what, you're the only one who can leave your fingerprints on this thing. Nobody else can. Everybody else would do that same idea differently. And your idea, your version of that idea, is incredibly valid and incredibly wanted and incredibly welcome. You need to know that there is room at the table for you. You don't have to go sit at the kids' table. You don't have to go hide in the corner or stay up in the tower. You can just come sit with everybody else, take up just as much space, and do the thing because you want to do it. And speaking of doing it, you also need to know that you can't mess this up. You can't screw this up. This isn't a thing you can fail at so catastrophically that you can't fix it. Now, yes, fine. Sometimes fixing it means starting over. Not always. That's not the only way we fix things, because you could always, oh no, I didn't clean my kitchen. I better demolish my house. Sure, that's one way of making sure your kitchen is clean. But you can always fix everything. You can always change everything. You don't only have to, nuke it from space. It's the only option. You have the ability to change anything right up until the point you decide, okay, I'm going to go put this book out in the world. And there's no timeline for that. There's no like urgency that says it has to be out. You have until Tuesday to make changes. And then come next Tuesday, you're hosed. There are no wrong answers. There are just answers you go with, and maybe they stick around. Maybe stuff from your first draft makes it all the way through. That's fine. That's not a badge of honor nor a badge of failure. That's just a thing that happened. You liked the fact that the couch was described this way, so you didn't change it. Great. Simple. There are no wrong answers. Everything is fixable. You can't mess this thing up so badly that other people will mock you or hate you or chase you away or tell you to quit. Everything is fixable. You can find a solution through every problem. You might not always like the solutions because they might involve, a little bit of hard work or some frustration, or you might have to ask for help. But there's always a solution. And you're in charge of it. You're in charge of finding it and using it or rejecting it or whatever. Everything is fixable. And lastly, before we move on to something more grounded and less abstract, you need to know that the only way your story with your view ends up in the world is if you do this. Yeah, you can farm out the work. You can have someone type your notes. You can use dictation software. You can do a million things to produce the story onto, from sound into text or something. But the only way any of this happens, the only way your book goes out into the world and stops just being this daydream you have or this hopeful fantasy that you have, the only way to get past that is for you to sit down and write it. It's not going to write itself. You don't have to take a million classes and get a billion college degrees or go to this fancy place and do this thing or anything like that. Sometimes it just comes down to putting your ass in a chair, sitting down and doing the work. And some days that work's going to be easy. And some days that work is going to be hard. And some days that work is going to feel, shrug, okay. But the only way this story stops only living in your brain and starts living out in the space where other people can engage with it is if you tell it. And you're the only one who can tell it your way. Publishing is big and scary and messy, and there's a lot of moving parts, and it's going to want to make you feel a lot of self-doubt because that's what gives the monster under the bed strength. Publishing is just a series of decisions. Some of those decisions are in your control. Some of those are not in your control. That's okay. Some kinds of publishing are all you and nobody else, and other kinds of publishing are loads of other people and not very much you. And that's okay. Your point, your value is not only in your success, it's in your effort. Do the thing. Believe in yourself that you can do the thing. And any part of the process along the way where you have doubt, where you're not sure what to do, you can find actual help that will support you and encourage you. I strongly encourage you to reconsider that. If you've sat there and been thinking, I can't get started, I don't know how to do this, really reconsider, because there's loads of people out here, I'm one of them, who would be happy to help you anytime. Let's get started. Let's do technical things for technical thing reasons. We're going to start with the basics because that's where we start with everything. Always start with the simple stuff that you can build from and go with and do things with, because if we jumped right into the deep end of theory, well, it would just sound really good on the internet, but it wouldn't do anything. It just wouldn't. Yeah, it just wouldn't really do it. So we're going to start with the basics. And we're starting in a position where most people don't expect me to start. I'm going to come from the position of, hey, I bet you have a plot in mind. Let's say we're writing a fantasy novel. Let's say we've made the decision that we're going to write in third person because it's big and broad and it tells a big story. And Maybe you've got a few key ideas in your mind. Oh, I have this one scene in my head. Oh, it looks like this. There's going to be this little guy and he's really tempted by a thing and he's got to figure out like what to do with it, and the whole fate of the world rests on this one person's seemingly simple but complicated decision. Maybe you have tons of scenes. Maybe there's a scene where two people fight over a volcano with laser swords. Maybe it's, there's a scene where the giant gorilla climbs up the Empire State Building. You have maybe images of scenes or ideas in your head. That's fine. That's great. But maybe you have a whole big thing. Oh, it's going to be this whole big world with all these different layers and groups and politicking and species and magic and power. That's fine too. But you need to collate that and start with a plot. And a plot has to do with conflict and challenge. So sit down right now and just start isolating what's the challenge? What's the conflict? If you had to boil this into a question, you would ask, what's the good guy trying to do in the story? Are we competing in a major contest to survive? Are we all high school students who are all, trying to kill each other in order to survive? Are we 15 knights questing for a magic cup? What's the challenge of our story? What's the conflict of our story? And then figure out where we could start. Not where we have to start, not where the only place to start is, just where are we starting? Because we need to be able to take the reader along for the whole ride. Because that's the point of laying everything out. Having these big giant ideas, you don't just, pick the few key elements and start right there. You roll them in. You take your time. You've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of words in some cases. If you're doing series, you don't just have to race to the good stuff because the reader is eager to reject you. This isn't like TikTok or something where we can just scroll if we get bored. You have a lot of time and space to use, so use it. Let's start with, what's the conflict and challenge of your story? If you haven't already, go write it down somewhere. Try to get it into 1 to 3 sentences. I understand that you might have to sort through some pieces or discount a few things to find, the heart of the story, and that's fine. But what's the conflict and what's the challenge? Because those questions are going to help drive everything else we do. On we go. Once we get that sorted, we got to figure out like who's doing this thing. So we have this challenge, so we have to destroy the piece of jewelry. We've got to hurl it in the volcano to destroy it to save the world. Well, now the next question is, who's doing that? Who's feeling tempted? Who's wanting to do this? Who wants to succeed? Who are the main characters? Our main characters, well, they're the protagonists. We need them. They're the ones who are going to undergo significant transformation. They're not just going to go from like point A to point B. I went from my house to the grocery store. That's fine. But your main characters are going to undergo significant change. They are definitely not going to be the same people, not with the same thoughts, the same ideas, the same philosophies, the same this is, the same that's. They're just not. And the reason we distinguish our main characters from our secondaries, those are our sidekicks, our love interests, our best friends. Did I say interests? Good job, John. All those other people who are adjacent to the story, who assist the story, but are not undergoing significant transformation. They're undergoing change and challenge that only affects within the walls and confines of the story. Those are your secondaries. So for us in our fantasy novel, well, we're going to have the person who's going to, convey the piece of jewelry across the story. And we're going to have, their best friend who represents sort of the thematic heart and purity of the story. They're not tempted so much. They're the good person who's the tether for our main character to travel from point A to point B and be transformed. But we don't only want to have just like two guys walking across a place to go do a thing. So let's add in some more people. How about we go with a pretty typical fantasy construction of a guy with some stubble and a troubled backstory who has to accept the reality of who he is. He sounds like a main character because he's going to significantly change and his actions are going to drive a lot of other stuff. And maybe he's, let's see, let's use some fantasy terminology. Maybe he's a ranger and we give him a troubled backstory because we want to tell the story a certain way. So maybe he's a ranger who's in fact next in line to be king, and he's sort of turned his back on that or rejected that because of a lot of different reasons. So those sound like main characters. But we can't just have those three guys because they would just go together as a group and go do stuff. We need to make this story big. We've got these big plans. Let's start adding extra stuff. Well, it's a fantasy story, so chances are we're going to need a wizard because you can tell a fantasy story without wizards, but wizards are fun. So let's add a wizard. And then we're going to need like just some more people to do some action stuff. So let's grab, I don't know, fantasy. Let's grab an elf and maybe a dwarf. Sure, let's do it. And we can buddy them up, and the comedy or the levity will be there because those are two groups who don't normally get along well in our story. So we can pit them against each other, but like in a friendly, fun way, and we can give them stuff to do. And maybe we want to like appeal to a broad audience. So we want to have a couple goofy characters who will change over time, but we're going to need some jokes. This could get heavy. This could get dark. Let's throw in two more little guys and just have them be funny little guys for a while and see what happens. Because the more characters we throw in here, because we're in third person, the more characters we can throw in, the more we can really accomplish because we'll have more possible pieces to move on our chessboard. And, a lot of stuff's going to happen. And why not just have Sean Bean so that we can kill Sean Bean? So, hey, here's Sean Bean. Let's make sure he dies. That'll be exciting because it's Sean Bean in a story. We need characters because these characters are going to make decisions and take actions. They're doing the plot. No way around it. On we go. Now we're going to need a world because we've got this conflict, we've got this challenge, and we've got people to do it, but all those things need a stage. Now, in our case, it's New Zealand. We're not going to call it New Zealand, but it's New Zealand. And that gives us a sense of topography and cartography, a sense of biome, a sense of space, a scale. And we can augment that and play with that as we need because we're creating our world. We literally summon the air and the water and the land and this and that and the other as we need to paint this picture. But our world is governed by rules. There are rules: gravity, physics, science, water temperature, air density, all things like physics, all that stuff, but also rules that dictate that elves and dwarves are at odds with one another, or that hobbits are tiny itty bitty people, or that there's a thing called a Dunedain Ranger, and they're weird old magical Atlantean people. The world has rules. Some of those rules are going to be constructive and crunchy, and some of those rules are going to be social. This class doesn't mix with that class. This group doesn't go with that group. This group hates that group. This group lives in this space, not in that space. There are loads of different rules. You're going to want to write them down and keep a running record. Not so much because we're trying to come up with the most complete magic number of rules, because there isn't. But you're going to want to at least keep the rules straight in your head so that as you're writing, you don't suddenly decide, you know what, I'm going to write about vampires, and then give them a weakness like they're all weak against raw chicken, and then suddenly decide, I'm just going to change the rules. Don't do that. You want to make sure that your rules are consistently applied within your world, and you want to give yourself enough wiggle room in the creation of that world to apply rules as you need. Not everything needs to be ruled. We don't need to rule like shoes have this many laces because that's ridiculous. But at the same time, you can rule on a lot of things. Is there currency? Are there horses? Is there gravity? Is it like Earth in a lot of regards? In what ways is it not like Earth, etc., etc.? And when we're doing this, when we're sitting down and we're figuring out, okay, like here's the way the world works. The other element we have to consider when we're building our world is, what are the opportunities? What things are out there? What cool spots can tourists go? What interesting things can we use for scenes? Are there, lots of towers dotting the landscape? Is there an intricate series of caves and mines? Are all the elves living in this weird sort of like slip and slide foresty place? There's loads of different things like that. Find the opportunities of your world, right alongside the rules of your world. Make a list, make a lot of lists. The opportunities of your world give you the ability to create scenes there, give you the ability to create subplots around those things. Your world has opportunities in it. Yeah, your story might just be, a bunch of kids going to prom in a small town, but there are still opportunities there, even within the confines of telling your story all within high school or something. There are always opportunities for characters to engage with or engage in affecting their world. Find your opportunities. But let's keep going, because you need one last ingredient. And this is something that is most definitely going to take you from I made up a thing to, oh, this thing is publishable. And that's a theme. A theme is, and there's another whole nother video on the channel about it. A theme is a lesson the reader takes away from the story, period. It's what your story is an example of. Oh, my story is an example of overcoming staggeringly impressive odds. Little guys can make a difference. Of believing in yourself in the face of adversity, or that selfish people will always fall victim to their greed, or that the best thing in the world are potatoes. That's not really a theme. That's just me trying to make a joke to relieve some anxiety. But the point is, you need a theme, probably more than one, probably fewer than three. One or two themes is plenty, because those themes, as we've talked about elsewhere, like if you went back and did some of the writing exercises where we covered the theme M, yeah, you'll see that you need to make sure that theme is represented in the events of your story. You can't just say, I have, found family as a theme, but then nothing in your story reflects or represents that. That's not accurate to say. You'd be wrong. You need a theme that's going to connect with the reader, so that when they think about your story, whatever it is, whether it's, two dudes leaving their small village, walking across New Zealand, or whether it's the story of temptation or the story of this or that, what's the big thing they're going to take away? What's going to stick with them beyond just the fact that you, the author, are very imaginative and made up of a ton of stuff? Theme is what helps stick the story to the reader. Theme is that, remember that blue gummy stuff we used to use to hang up posters on the wall? Or it's duct tape that's binding the universe together. That's what themes do. It helps hold everything together, like potatoes. Themes are important, and generally one of the top 3 reasons why stuff doesn't get published traditionally is because it's lacking a theme, or its theme is stated in this, it's put in the query letter, but it's really poorly represented in text. Theme matters. There's a whole video on theme over on the channel. Go give it a watch after this. But on we go, because now we're going to get into it. We know we need those basics. Maybe you skipped ahead to this part because you just know, like, oh, I know all the obvious stuff, John. Fine. Let's build some scenes. Let's talk about how to write and organize this story, because organizing is not necessarily always the same as setting the table in its entirety before the first piece of food hits it. Building those scenes and constructing things is an ever evolving process, and you can organize as you go. But to do that, we need to understand what it is we're organizing, which means we're going to talk about scenes that involve characters, scenes that advance plot, scenes that develop conflict, scenes that occur within the world. We need to talk about scenes. So now, here are the 4 types of scenes you are most likely going to run into in the course of writing whatever the hell it is you're writing. You will have scenes that introduce stuff that the reader doesn't know until they read the thing. You will have scenes that develop information that they already know, but now they're getting more clarification on. We introduced it already, now we're going to add to it. We're developing it. There will be scenes that include conflict, whether that's a fight or a tense argument or the story climax. There will be some kind of conflict between people in the scene. And then, because there's been conflict or any kind of tension or development, there will be scenes with consequences. Because this other stuff happened, now this does. Because of X, then Y. Consequences. Those 4 scene types, thinking about your story in terms of its pieces, across those 4 points. Is this scene a scene that introduces? Is this scene a scene that develops? Is this scene a scene with conflict? And just so we're clear, yeah, you can have a scene that does all those things. And you can have a scene with parts of each of it. You can have a scene like, let's say you're bringing your two characters to the dining room table with a guest. That scene can introduce things like the dining room and develop the relationship between characters, but create conflict between the two characters because the guest in one of your characters disagrees over something, and it can have consequences because as things, stem from that disagreement, then that house guest from earlier in the story becomes the villain at the end of the story. Scenes can overlap. They can contain all these different parts, but we need to identify these parts so that when you start writing and you ask yourself, hey, what's this scene? What is this? What am I doing here? Not just, oh, this is the fun scene where the two characters do XYZ. You need to know what kind of scene it is. What's our goal here? What are we trying to accomplish by writing it? Is this a scene that introduces? Is this a scene that develops? Is this a scene with conflict? Is it a scene with consequences? Let's break these down. Let's get chewier about this. So all scenes, I don't care what kind of scene it is, conflict, introduction, development, consequence, whatever. All scenes are going to have the following thing. They're going to be characters in it. All scenes will take place at some kind of location or locations. Every character in that scene will have a goal, maybe more than one goal, but definitely at least one. And then because they have goals and they're in a place and they are people, there will be obstacles or challenges in front of them that are preventing them from immediately just accomplishing their goal. Why can't they just already do the thing? Why can't they just take the big flying eagles to drop the ring in the volcano? What are the challenges set up against accomplishing every goal in every scene for every character? Now, on the screen, there's a little square of a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet is what I give to clients. That's part of the Build a Novel workbook. And it's just a straight up list. You list the number of the scenes. It doesn't really matter, but people like to number them just to keep track. The name of the scene. Hey, what kind of scene is this? Where does this scene take place? The location. Who's in this scene? What is each character trying to do? And why isn't it easy for them to do it? That kind of straightforward organization. And it doesn't need to be more than that. There are other columns in the spreadsheet. There are more bells and whistles, but you don't need them right now at this moment. It's not going to help you if you're somebody who's been stuck or stalled out. Learning about the extra mega depths of like, oh, by the way, there's this emotional influence and that thing isn't going to help you right now. Character, location, goals, and challenges can build you enough of a framework to tell any story and pull any draft out of whatever paralysis or downward spiral you have. All the scenes we're going to talk about, all the different types of scenes, will always do this. So what does it look like when we fill it out? What does it look like when we actually turn this practical? Because I'm a big guy who's a big fan of practical. So let's fill this out. We have, let's say, scene 3, which is an introduction scene. And we are calling it for our notes, the Meet the Hobbits scene. And it takes place in the Shire where the hobbits live. And in this scene, we have all the hobbits and Gandalf. And they're what are they doing here? What are their goals? Well, people want to go to Bilbo's party, and they want to hang out with their precious. Those seem like good goals. Now, why? What's making it difficult? What's making it a challenge? Why is that just not easy and done and no big deal? Well, there are fireworks that blow everything up. The precious is itself a problem, and everybody's worried about getting too wasted. Okay, so that's an introduction scene. Maybe we have a development scene later on that we're calling the Fellowship is formed. And where does that take place? It takes place on the Rivendell Fellowship patio. That's just where the scene is. Who's there? Well, it's everybody in the Fellowship and Agent Smith from the Matrix. Just a guy giving exposition. What's the goal? What is everybody supposed to be doing here? Well, they got to figure out what to do with the ring, and they should know they just can't walk into Mordor. And why is this difficult? Well, because somebody needs to take the ring. And there's no singing at this point in the story because, there's just a lot of talking going on and it's very heavy. So it's not easy to navigate their way through. But we're going on, and all of a sudden we're deeper into the story and we get conflict. And we're going to call this scene, they brought hobbits to an orc fight. Now, we're not going to obviously write that in the book. We're not going to call this, chapter 61, they brought hobbits to an orc fight. Although I should point out, I would, but you don't have to. Maybe this is just shorthand for you. All your novel building, organizing tools are just for you. You don't have to take it so seriously. No one's coming to give you a grade on how clearly you've written your thing. This one's just for you. So where does this scene, they brought hobbits to an orc fight, take place? In the woods. What woods? The woods. Woods. Who's here? Well, it's the Fellowship, as we've talked about before, and orcs, because, orcs, because you brought hobbits to an orc fight. So what are the goals? Well, mostly don't die. Okay, that seems like a reasonable goal for a lot of characters. Anything else? They got to kill some orcs. And by the end of this scene, the party should be in some way fractured or separated, because that's what we need to move the story forward. Okay, that's a great goal. What's in the way? What are the obstacles? Well, the orcs are certainly an obstacle towards that not dying goal. Dying is an obstacle because it makes it hard to split the party up when members of the party are dying. And, just for the sake of argument, Sean Bean's not dead yet. So that's an obstacle in that whole like moving the story forward thing. So we've had an introduction, we've had a development, we've had some conflict. Now let's talk about consequences. So later on in the story, we're going to get a scene that we will call "Don't You Lose Him, Samwise," because that's a line that makes John cry. So let's label a scene that. Where does that take place? On the water. Just specifically, the water. Who's in the scene? Frodo and Sam, our two characters. What are they trying to do? They're going to try to walk into Mordor. Remember that thing we talked about? It was a goal not to do before. Now it's a goal. What's the point? Why does this scene matter? Well, the idea is, one, don't drown because, they're in boats on the water, and they have to learn not to give up and do this together. It can be as easy as that. No big complication. No big, oh my God, I have this and this and this. No, just make lists. Just make a spreadsheet. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. It does not have to be complicated in order for you to demonstrate that you are good at it. Making something complicated is great if our goal is to show how complicated we can make a thing. Making something complicated to the point where you can't navigate it easily and you don't feel empowered to use it constantly accomplishes nothing. It really can be as easy as making a list. So let's attack these scene types. The scenes that introduce. When we think about these scenes, we want to ask the question, what should the reader see in their mind as they read whatever sentence they're reading? Now they read one sentence at a time. They read left to right, then they go from left to right to top of the page to the bottom of the page. Then they turn the page and keep going. So on a sentence by sentence basis, your job is to help them put a picture, maybe a moving picture with sound and texture and color and all these things, but still a picture in their heads. So when they read that sentence, whatever you write, what should they picture? What should they understand? And if you don't give them a lot of detail, they're not going to really understand entirely. They might get close, but it's up to you to be specific when it's time to be specific. And we'll talk about, why you can't give everything in a second. But the goal here, in addition to trying to answer that question of when I read this sentence, what should I picture in my brain, is that you want to describe things, anything. The scene, the moment, how the character feels, the weather, the roof, the sky, the ground, the dog, the cats, the whatevers, as though the reader is there in that space, standing within an arm's distance-ish of the character, probably, or maybe slightly farther away, but not too much farther. We don't want to put them on the moon and then try to describe like what I'm doing with my hand on this desk a million miles away. You want to give the reader a sense of being there, that the things they are reading about feel real and not just imagined, or not just like intellectually understood as like, oh, I know what that word means. A lot of writers hear that and they think, oh, well, I have to give you every detail, like all at once under the sun immediately. And you don't. You have an entire book. An absolute positively entire book somewhere, depending on what you're writing, between 70,000 and 120,000 words mostly. That's a lot of words. That's a lot of time and space, a lot of chapters, a lot of pages. If we don't learn the couch has, that like weird slipcover on it until chapter 9, well, then it does. So what? You don't have to give all the information up front. You don't even have to give all the information all at once. And not all the information you want to give is worth giving. Because while it is really nice to know that you, the writer, have created a room with a couch that has a plastic slipcover on it, if we don't need to know it has a slipcover because we're just sitting on a couch, well, then we don't know that detail. Or the exact shade of green in this carpet. Is it really critical? Yes, our image is increased in specificity, but is our substantial understanding of the story changed because you've identified it as British racing green as opposed to conifer green? Like, that detail might be important if you were giving us a quiz or a test, but you've just instead handed us your story. We're not going to care the way you care. That doesn't make you wrong. It's just that not every piece of information is going to be pivotal and necessary for us the way that it might be for you. Introduction scenes add new information to our existing space, our existing imagination, our existing page, our existing understanding of the story. We introduce things. That can be objects, that can be moods, that can be feelings, that can be sound, that can be dialogue, that can be any element. On we go. Following that up, we get to develop stuff. And we're going to again ask that question, what should the reader see when they read the sentence? You're giving them new details. So how does the new detail attach to the old stuff you gave them? How does it help the reader feel like they're there? So, okay, we've got this couch, we've got this dining room. We've started detailing some of it. Now we're going to detail a little bit more of it. Now, we're not always going to be talking about the creakiness of the wooden chairs or the scrape of silverware on plates. Sometimes we're going to talk about the room feeling cold when people are talking about scary things, or the room being bright, or how the room gets still. We're not always going to describe things in the same sort of type of sense. We're not always going to describe things in the same depth of detail, but you are always looking to add more to what you've already introduced. And the shorthand for this is, what's the one thing, what's the plus one that you are adding to the pile of what people already know to make them feel like what they already know, plus this new thing, is helping the scene feel material, substantial, like it matters. Because if you're just naming things to name things, if you're just telling me, okay, there's 16 chairs and 7 of them were made by Bob and 3 of them were made by Kevin, why does that matter? It's nice to know that you made that up. It's nice to know that you developed it, but how is that going to help me see the big picture? Am I going to need to remember that Kevin made those particular chairs? Be very careful in over detail. Be very careful in overwriting, because it doesn't necessarily help the reader engage with the story. Your goal, and this is where things get a little dicey for newer writers, your goal is to produce the best movie in the reader's imagination as possible. The best. Whatever you think the best movie is, picture it in your head right now. You want to do that level of quality for your stuff. How do you do that? By not necessarily detailing every inch of everything, but by picking and choosing what you pay attention to and what you hold back from so that the reader can follow along. Not all details are created equal. Not all details are equally necessary. You get to develop information as the needs of the story arise. On we go. Which takes us to the conflicts. Now, there's loads of different conflicts in stories. Sure, the climax is a kind of conflict, but our goal here is to understand that any interaction where there's a power imbalance or the potential for something to happen, there's a potential for consequences, is technically a conflict scene. You and I arguing about whose turn it is to do the dishes. That's conflict. Just as much conflict as you being frustrated that somebody took your parking space at the grocery store, which is just as much conflict as you staring at your boss, hoping they don't notice you staring, or the conflict that you're waiting for someone to respond to a text message because they said, do you have a minute? And now that your stomach has fallen and you're worried, that's still a kind of conflict. Conflict addresses two major questions. What's in danger here? What's the status quo that could be possibly changed in some way? I could get this parking space. They could break up with me. The bad guy might fire their gun at me. We might learn a terrible secret. There's some kind of danger here. It's not always physical danger. Sometimes it's social or emotional or psychological. And it might not always be, major life-threatening danger. It's just a change to the way things are. But there's always that potential. There's always that element of unknownness. And likewise, all conflict is predicated. It's built on the idea that somebody wants something. It's not always a physical object. I don't only want the Ark of the Covenant before the Nazis get it, but there's always a desire. Somebody's got a plan and a goal to do a thing or get a thing, and this obstacle or challenge is in the way. We can flip this around and look at the other side of conflict, because conflict is not always easy, but it's also not always impossible. It's not always big, giant stakes. We're not always trying to defend the free world. Sometimes we're just trying to successfully navigate the grocery store to get yogurt. So we must always ask ourselves, what's in the way? Why isn't this task easy? What's making this difficult? What's making this more complicated or more profound? And likewise, in the course of doing all this effort, the characters involved in conflict have to pay a price. They have to, every time, even if that price is just the consumption of time. I can't believe I'm arguing with you about whose turn it is to do the dishes. Well, that price that gets paid is maybe my roommate gets a little mad at me or something, or it just takes 5 seconds out of my day when I wanted to instead be doing something else. There's always a price to pay with conflict. Thinking about your conflicts, your climaxes, your social interactions, your whatevers, in terms of danger and desire and obstacle and cost or price matters. When I talk about this stuff, most everybody tends to frame it in terms of the fight scenes. Oh, so then they fight the dragon. So then, they square off with the ninjas. That's fine. Totally fine. But remember that not all conflict is physical combat. It's not all magical combat either. It's sometimes not even aggressive combat whatsoever. There's plenty of conflict in one person talking to somebody they don't like, or there's plenty of personal conflict in, oh my God, do I tell this person how I feel? There's always a kind of conflict between a want a character has and the status quo they exist in. Remember that not all combat is going to carry immediate consequences. It's one thing if we're in a fight and you punch me and break my nose, there's a very immediate consequence to that. But it's also possible that in the course of this fight, you and I part ways, never see each other again for 6 months. But then upon hearing that I'm back in town and seeking revenge, the consequence of you breaking my nose becomes suddenly apparent, even if it wasn't immediate. There are always consequences. They're just not always going to immediately follow the action that creates them. Which takes us to consequences. Everything in a story has a consequence somewhere. Everything. Even the benign stuff, like you describing lunch that the character has, there's a consequence to doing that. Even if that consequence is just, well, I wrote a sentence and it takes up word count and it sits on this page. That's as much a consequence as you're going to get out of describing, yeah, so I had a Coke. But there's always a consequence, always, for everything. And you want to ask yourself a few questions around it, primarily being something happened to make this happen. So because X happened, what now? Because the vampire bit us, or because the zombies swarmed us, now what? Because we're locked in this room during a snowstorm with the person we have a crush on, what now? And because something led us to the moment where there are consequences, something has changed. Because we, decided to enter the drag race down Devil's Backbone, something's changed. There's an extra new sense of pressure. There's a nervousness. There's something now that didn't exist before. We don't know what it is. We won't know till we do it. We won't know till we explore it. But there is a change, and there is something that you need to know. This is the sort of thing you just write down when you're going through your scenes, one thing after the other. Here's a scene. It's a consequence scene. What's the obstacle? What's in the way? What changes? Why does this scene matter? And when you're writing your text, here's what's going on. This is what the reader needs to picture. This is why it's important. We can make this slightly more practical by considering some abstract things. So you and I are in a scene, we're arguing. We're arguing about whatever. Maybe it's whose turn it is to do dishes, or who drank the last of the juice and left the empty container in the fridge. Every set of consequences can be measured in terms of gains and losses. Every single one of them. Whether it's, the bad guy got shot, so he lost his life, versus the good guy gained victory over his enemy. Gain and loss. What are the gains and losses of explaining, that, oh, I knew who killed the guy this entire time. I'm just now finding it out. Gains and losses. Measure your sense of scene construction, who's doing what, why, when, and where, based on who's gaining something and who loses something by those events happening. And likewise, like we had talked about when we were dealing with conflict and other stuff, there is that price to get paid. So what is it? Somebody has to pay it. What do they have to give up? Does the innocent person who's been exposed to the horrors of the magical world suddenly have to grapple with the idea that most of what they knew was a lie? Is it a matter of discovering that when you become a vampire, you are cursed on some level to hate the people who made you? Is it an existentially lonely and empty existence? Is it a tragically beautiful existence? Are you discovering that, you can't trust adults anymore because the last 5 adults in your life turned out to be, space aliens from Jupiter? There's always a price that gets paid by somebody in the story for something. And likewise, consequences don't always have to be known and stated. If I do a thing today, let's say I record this video and it goes up and it posts, and you don't see it at the time I'm recording it, it is May of 2024, right? If you don't see this until June of 2025, I'm not going to know. But if you listen to this in June of 2025, suddenly go back through the entire catalog of everything and suddenly, get inspired to write, and you go write a book, those consequences are unknown to me. They were unknown to you at the time too. But consequences are not always known and stated at the time it happens. You can hold stuff back from the reader. That's fine. That's okay. You can do that. It's about controlling and understanding what happens and what follows what happens. So now let's talk about acts. Now, we laid out scenes because you can just make lists. You can put them on note cards. I have a spreadsheet I give clients. You just fill it out. But you can take acts as collections of scenes. They can be their own spreadsheets. They can be their own lists. But we have to understand act structure as a collection of scenes in order to organize our story, whatever it might be. Now, we're assuming for this typical 3-act structure. Are there other structures? Sure. Do they matter? Not today. Other days, sure. But 9 times out of 10, don't reinvent the wheel. 3-act structure is just fine. So here's Act 1. What does it look like? Act 1 is going to have a lot of introduction scenes and a lot of development scenes. And because our story is just getting started, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, conflict and consequences are relatively minor. That doesn't mean insignificant. It just means that they don't necessarily super persist, and they're not a big giant deal to the story. So you'll have a lot of intro and development because it's the beginning of the book. That makes sense. You're going to bring up things that you didn't know before, and you're going to develop them, laying the groundwork to move forward. How big is this act? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. It's not like there's a magic number. It's not like, oh, you need 4 scenes or 10 pages. Does not matter. The only way you know you are done this act is when the next thing that would happen starts the plot. Period. Now, I've said this before, and somebody once got very, what's the word I want to use? Cranky might be a good word. They got very cranky that they basically started their plot on the second paragraph of the first page. Does that mean that their first act was a paragraph? Technically, yes, which is why you generally want to not do that. But it doesn't need to be like verified. It's a pretty fluid model. It's just that when the next thing you start doing is the plot exclusively, you've moved from the first act to the second act. For act number one is setup. We're laying out stuff that you need to know. Not everything, because remember, we don't have to hold everything all up front, but it's enough stuff to get us started. And then when the next thing is the plot starts, whether our character leans over to the other character and says, we have to go drop this jewelry off in a volcano. Well, then I guess we're in Act 2. And we can be in Act 2 for a while because the majority of Act 2 is our story. And you're going to see all four of these scene types. You will introduce more stuff. And remember, introduction does not only live in Act 1. Introduction happens lots. There are times where we're not going to introduce so much, but for the most part, a lot of introduction and development lives in Act 1 and Act 2. You're going to see conflict. There are going to be fights along the way. There are going to be consequences along the way. And the story, the bulk of the story is Act 2. And that means Act 2 is huge. Act 2 should be, in theory, bigger than Act 1. How much bigger? Yes, just bigger. And that's why we map it out in terms of scenes more than acts. That's why we map it out in terms of scenes more than pages or chapters. Act 2 is where your story gets going, where it develops. It was started at the beginning of Act 2, and we're building and we're building and we're building until the next thing we would do would be the climax. It does not include the climax. We stop just short of the climax starting. So that could be a lot of space. That might be 2/3 of your manuscript. That's fine. It might be half. That's fine. It's really at that point more about the feel of the story, how well you're telling it, how smoothly it's going from piece to piece and scene to scene and idea to idea, than it is saying, I've hit this word, I'm at this word, so therefore I must do this. There are some styles of writing, there are some constructions of stories that do say things like that, but by and large, it's not that critical to think about. Don't try and nail it down and go, at word, 60,000, you need to be doing this, because it doesn't always matter. Act 2 exists and persists and develops until the next thing, the only next thing you can do would be to kick off the climax, which takes us to the climax. And at this point, you're probably done introducing things, at least significant things. But here you are going to deal with developing and conflict and consequences. Every possible element is at its most whatever at this point. It is the peak of the storytelling mountain, if you want to call it that. Everything is the most dangerous. Everything is the riskiest. Everything is the hardest. Everything is the most thrilling. Everything is the most whateverist. It involves the most possible pieces, not all of them, but certainly the most significant ones. Now, that doesn't mean they all have to happen in the same scene to the same people. It's not like 25 people need to be crammed in this living room, but it all relatively needs to be happening at roughly the same point in the story. If you have multiple stories going on, let's say you've got 2 people in a living room in one house, and then 3 people in the courthouse downtown, and then 2 more people out in the mine behind the high school, you want to try and get those individual climaxes of that development more or less going at the same time. Because if one of those things ends early, the story is going to feel a little lopsided. It's going to feel a little underdeveloped. You want to try and synchronize your different braids and threads of story. Your climax ends in the literal sentence, in the literal word where whatever the conflict was is resolved. So if your conflict is, will this person win the karate tournament against that person? The minute, the kid crane kicks the blonde kid in the face, that's where the climax turns. That's where the resolution begins. Once the conflict is gone in that sentence, everything from that verb or the middle of that comma or whatever, from that point forward, you're in the resolution. You're done. You're in the third act. Climaxes tend to be pretty short by comparison. They're nowhere near as big as the second act. They're not as big as the first act. They're tiny, usually, a few scenes, a chapter or two or three compared to a much larger run or stretch of page space. But climaxes are important because they're the thing that all the story has been built up to. Which takes us to Act 3, where again, we are most definitely not introducing things because it's the end of the story. There's not a whole lot else to introduce. We can develop what we've got. There might still be some ancillary conflict, but by and large, we're going to deal with developing and focusing on the consequences because all this stuff happened because we dropped the ring in the volcano, because we went over here and did this, because we won the karate tournament, because we raised enough money to save the record store. Whatever it is, there is some kind of resolution, and it happens in Act 3. Act 3 starts once the climax has tipped and changed, and it ends when the story ends. Period. Simple. Super simple. So, how do we put this together? Take your elements of your story and arrange them according to the 4 scene types in kind of a cycle. We introduce an idea. We develop an idea. There's some kind of conflict around that idea. And then there are consequences from it. That doesn't always mean it happens in the same scene. That doesn't always mean it happens in the same chapter. Doesn't always mean it happens in the same act. Doesn't mean it has to happen in the same paragraph. But we introduce a thing, we develop it, there's conflict about it, and there's consequences all the time. When we write it out, we're going to write about it in what's called forward progression because the story moves ideally, barring exception, forward in time. When we want to double check it to make sure that our scenes are arranged smoothly so that we don't have a pacing issue, so that our story reads smoothly and is most engaging, we're actually going to work backwards. So, for instance, we have to kill Sean Bean. That's our consequence. How do we kill Sean Bean? Well, we needed a conflict to create the consequence. So if the consequence is Sean Bean's dead, there has to be a conflict to kill him. So he's got to eat a lot of arrows in that orc fight. And the only way we can eat arrows in an orc fight is if we establish that there are orcs and set them up to chase down our heroes and give them bows. And the only way we can do that is if we explain where the orcs came from. So we can't kill Sean Bean without introducing Sean Bean and orcs. We work backwards from consequence to conflict to develop to introduction to double check our work. And when we tell our story, we go introduction, development, conflict, consequences. We move forward in the cycle to get everything going around. You're going to do this from scene to scene. So at the beginning of our scene, we introduce things, we develop things within our scene. Is there a conflict or a challenge in our scene? Then we move to consequences in our scene. Then we go to the next scene and we're right back to introduce, develop, conflict, consequence, I, D, C, C. Next scene, we're going to do it for themes, I, D, C, C. We're going to do it for, plot arc, I, D, C, C, over and over and over. You were going to take every single significant thing in your story, your main character, your antagonist, the plot conflict, the character arc they're on, and you're going to feed it into this cycle. Now, if you've heard me just say that and you're like, oh my God, I have so many parts. Hey, guess what? You might have too many parts. That's allowed. That's really allowed. And you can trim it down. I would strongly recommend if you get to this far in this video, by the way, thank you for watching. But if you get this far and you're like, I have too many parts this applies to, trim it down. Reduce some number of it, reduce the depth you're giving to it, reduce the number of moving total complex parts. You don't have to pare it down to the bare nothing. We're not trying to do like, I have to mow the lawn, so I'm going to shave it down to dirt. You just got to cut it into a more manageable chunk. This can be a lot. And by no means did any of the spreadsheet stuff from way back. Actually, it's this one from way back here, cover all of this. There's a lot here. There's a lot of moving parts. And so let me tell you this, and as we get out of here. So this can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. Absolutely, it can be. I don't want it to be complicated for you. I want you to be able to do this. And I want you to be able to get the help you need to do this. And I know a lot of people hear that and balk. They get very tight-fisted about it or very upset about it because, oh my God, it's going to take time, it's expensive, it's hard, it's embarrassing. I don't want to feel like I'm wasting my time or anything like that. Let me tell you a few of the easiest ways you can use this stuff to make progress. And I'm going to start from a very personal position and work outward. If you have $2 a month, just $2, $2 a month, I would recommend you go down to the Patreon that's linked in the description below and spend $2 a month. That's going to give you access to the Discord. In that Discord, you can spend all the time you want asking every single question about how to write whatever, all you want. And I will do my best, as best I can, to answer as many of them as I can to any kind of degree possible. Might not always be immediate, might not always be super detailed, but it'll be something. $2 a month gets you a lot. Maybe that's a little too slow, though. Maybe you want something more intensive. Okay. Head over to johnhelpsyouwritebetter.com. There's a link down in the description. Book an appointment. There's a free appointment. It's half an hour long. You can very easily book a half an hour appointment and just ask every question you have. Okay, here's my story. Here's the first 2 pages. You can send me that before you book the appointment, and we'll go over it and we'll talk about it. And if you have a million questions about how to write a plot, how do I fix this? How do I do this? You just come and ask for free. Free. It's not even $2 anymore. But maybe that's not what you're interested in. Maybe you want something different. Maybe you want something very hands-on. Maybe you want the whole spreadsheet with all its moving parts, where we break down the world and the rules and how you're going to craft this and shape this and who connects to what and who goes where, and then how you're going to market it and how you're going to publish it. Maybe you want the biggest, best roadmap possible. Guess what you do? Back down to that website, johnhelpsyouwritebetter.com, book an appointment. $39 for half an hour, $89 for an hour. Talk to me about your story. I'll get you the notebook. You can sit there and fill out a spreadsheet till your heart's content, laying out all the details and all the pieces. Book a couple appointments and we'll go through page by page, line by line, item by item, and give you the roadmap you've always wanted for your story. It doesn't have to remain abstract. You don't have to just do it, whenever, because you don't think you're good enough. I promise you, you're good enough. I promise you that there is more than enough opportunity here and enough material here for you to succeed. You just have to try. I can do a lot. I can give you a million tools. I can talk to you about what's the best way to kill Sean Bean in a movie or a story until I'm blue in the face. But the final, and honestly, the only decision that matters is your decision to do something about it. It's a big deal. It is important to you. You have every reason and right to succeed. So, how can I help you succeed? If you have questions, ask them. The only way they're going to get answered is if you ask. Even if you think they're stupid questions, even if you think like everybody's asked this before, fine. Then everybody's asked and you're asking too. That's okay. I want to help you. I really do. This is my job. I love to do this. I want to help you. I want you to see that you're good enough to do this. I want to see you take your idea that's lived in your head as a daydream and a fantasy and a hope one day, and I want to see you turn it into a thing that you can do something with, that you can sell on Amazon, that you can publish, that you can say, I wrote and finished a story, that you have this and you have that. You can do that. I want to help. Whether that's $2 a month or a free appointment or a paid appointment or with a spreadsheet or whatever, I want to help you do this. You're good enough to. I believe in you. And if you have any questions at any time, let me know. down below in the comments section. I would love to answer. It would be great. There are no dumb questions. I'm happy to answer all of them. Fire away. Let's get out of here, though. I've been talking for, oh man, an hour and 15 minutes. So, mouthful of water. Oh, that's better. Thanks for being here. Thanks for checking this out. Remember, organizing your story comes down to simple steps done repeatedly. Not big, complicated things, not over indulgent, messy things, small, simple decisions done a million times so that you can see the evidence of progress. Oh, look, I wrote that down. Oh, look, I wrote that down. And you go through one at a time, one scene at a time, one character at a time, one item at a time, over and over and over until you're done. That's how you get progress. That's how you advance from point A to point B. It's not wait until the moon is blue and then do it all in one big rush. It's not do it when the mood strikes you. It's not, do it once every once in a while and then just hope somehow it's different. Consistent small steps are the most effective way to get you from where you're at to where you want to be. This makes those steps easier. And it matters because you matter, because your story matters. Thank you so much for checking this out. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to me go on for an hour and change. Thanks for letting me do a video and not a stream. I really appreciate it. If you liked this and you want to see more of it, there's plenty more on the YouTube channel. Go check it out too. If you want to support this and you want to see more of this and you want to suggest things to talk about, patreon.com/John helps you write better. Make some suggestions. If you want to if you want the whole notebook, go book an appointment. JohnHelpsYouWriteBetter.com. Click the thing in the top corner. You can't miss it. Book a free appointment. It'll help. If you want me like this in your ear every day, wherever you get your podcasts, go listen to John Helps You Write Better wherever you get podcasts. I'm on all the places. At least I was as of, this morning. If for some reason I'm not somewhere, I can get you a link to it. That's fine. But chances are I'm everywhere. Thanks for being here. Thanks for checking this out. I will talk to you very soon. All power to all people. Remember that you're good enough. You can do this. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be overwhelmed, but it's up to you to do something beyond just being scared, because the only way through a hard thing is through a thing. You can go around it. You can cheat it. You can duck it. You can dodge it. But at some point, you're going to have to roll your sleeves up and take a chance. And you're good enough to succeed. And when you need help, come get help. I'll talk to you soon.